Welcome to your friendly neighborhood historian, where we discuss just enough history to inform, intrigue, and entertain. I'm Bill Petro. The history of Thanksgiving, the secular and the sacred. The origin of Thanksgiving Day in America has been attributed to a harvest feast the Pilgrims held at the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. Why did the Pilgrims come to America? How was it that they didn't land at their intended destination? When was the first Thanksgiving in America, and how did it become a modern holiday? In 1621, Governor William Bradford of the Massachusetts colony proclaimed a day of thanksgiving and prayer to celebrate the Pilgrims' first harvest in America, the year after their arrival on the merchant ship Mayflower. However, the typical picture you see of a few Native American men joining the Pilgrims at the feast is rather inaccurate. Instead, we know that some 90 Native American men visited Plymouth for 3 days of fish, fowl, and venison. However, of the 102 English settlers who had spent their first year on the Massachusetts coast, about half the passengers had died by this time. This would have left about half of the remaining 53 English survivors as men, so the native men outnumbered the English men by over 3-1. What motivated the Pilgrims to come to America? Well, the idea of them fleeing England to come directly to America due to persecution is not entirely historically accurate, at least in terms of their starting point. Instead, over a decade earlier, they'd already left England for Holland as dissenters of the Church of England. They were unwilling to comply with obligatory Church of England worship practices and were consequently subject to fines if they stayed in England. These Pilgrims were English Calvinists in their theology, and they found that Dutch Calvinism was more tolerant of their religious practices than they had experienced in England. However, they noticed that after a while in Holland, their children were forgetting how to speak English and were adopting Dutch customs too liberal for their sensibilities. Therefore, they intended to move to America, having heard of a successful settlement in Virginia, and hoped to arrive in the north of the Virginia Company at the Hudson River's mouth, in an area chartered to be called New England. As I mentioned, their ship, the Mayflower, was not a passenger vessel, but a merchant ship. I've stood inside the belly of the Mayflower II, a replica of the original Mayflower, and I must say, it is snug. The Atlantic passage they took was difficult. 1 passenger and 1 crewman died along the way, and 1 baby was born, named, appropriately, Oceanus. The Pilgrims had left Holland by way of England, departing from southwest England from the town of Plymouth on the coast, and spent about 2 months crossing the Atlantic Ocean for the American coast. The weather, however, was against them. They could not reach the Hudson River, prevented by currents and shoals, so they landed instead at Provincetown Harbor on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This was some 500 miles off course. Ultimately, the ship's complement disembarked at New Plymouth upon Plymouth Rock. Now, because they did not land at their original destination, they lacked a charter for where they did land. The Pilgrims were worried that descent among the non-Pilgrim passengers on the Mayflower would result in mutiny and rebellion. So, the Pilgrims wrote up what was later called the Mayflower Compact, a document of temporary laws to rule themselves by majority rule. 41 adult males and 2 indentured servants signed it, creating America's first enduring democratic self-government document. The document was probably written by the pastor William Brewster. His journal summarized it in calling for continued allegiance to to King James I of England, notwithstanding their relocation to America for religious freedom, one society with an effort to work together to further the colony, and living in accordance with the Christian faith. Now, there is some controversy in America as to where and when the first Thanksgiving was held, both in terms of date and location. Puritans arrived in America from England 9 or 10 years after the Pilgrims and claimed a Thanksgiving holiday in Boston in 1631. Now, the Irish have a claim as well. A ship arrived from Dublin on February 21st, 1621, with food stocks at Plymouth Rock for the starving pilgrims. That date differs from the aforementioned autumn Thanksgiving feast date. The Spanish had a more religious service than a holiday. Explorers in San Elizario, Texas, held a Thanksgiving feast in 1592. Other claims point to a Spanish celebration on September 8, 1565, in St. Augustine, Florida. Virginia, where the founding charter in Charles City County by the Berkeley Hundred, that was an early Virginia colony land grant. They pinned their Thanksgiving service to 1619. As far as formal Thanksgiving proclamations, one of the first ones was made in Charlestown, Massachusetts, in 1676. In 1789, President George Washington issued the first presidential Thanksgiving proclamation in honor of the new U.S. Constitution, establishing Thursday, November 26th as, quote, Day of Public Thanksgiving. During the 19th century, an increasing number of states annually observed a Thanksgiving feast, each appointing its own day. President Abraham Lincoln, on October 3rd, 1863, appointed the last Thursday in November as Thanksgiving Day, due to the unremitting efforts of Sarah J. Hale, editor of Goody's Lady's Book. Now, in the 20th century in America, succeeding presidents had made proclamations until Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939. During his long presidency, there were 2 Novembers that had 5 Thursdays. In response to business leaders' repeated requests for a more extended pre-Christmas shopping season, FDR appointed the next to last Thursday of November as Thanksgiving, primarily to allow a special holiday weekend for the national public holiday. But not all leaders agreed. 16 state governors continued to set Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November, as had been traditional. This confusion went on for 2 years, until finally, on December 26, 1941, both Congress and the President agreed to the 4th Thursday of November for Thanksgiving. In conclusion, the idea of a day set apart to celebrate the harvest completion and render homage to the spirit who caused the fruits and crops to grow is both ancient and universal. The practice of designating a day of Thanksgiving for special spiritual or secular benefits has been followed in many countries around the world. Thanksgiving Day remains a day when many express gratitude to God for blessings and celebrate material bounty. By the way, I've often been asked if the British also celebrate a day of Thanksgiving. They do, but they observe it on July the 4th. Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Petro, your friendly neighborhood historian. You can find more details on this topic and others on my website at billpetro.com.